November 23rd, 1942. 6 miles above the French coast, near Saint-Nazaire. Hauptmann Egon Mayer rolled his Focke-Wulf 190 into attack position and stared at something that defied every tactical principle the Luftwaffe had taught him. A formation of 12 B-17 flying fortresses, arranged in a staggered combat box, their polished aluminum skin reflecting the morning sun like a field of mirrors. He'd read the intelligence briefings. American bombers were heavily armed, yes, but their guns were positioned for defense against attacks from behind and below. Standard fighter tactics meant approaching from the rear quarter, staying out of the worst firing arcs, accepting some defensive fire as the price of getting close enough to hit them with 20mm cannon. But Mayer had studied the crashed B-17 at Rechlin. He'd walked around it, counted the gun positions, measured the firing angles, and he'd realized something the intelligence briefings hadn't emphasized. The nose of the B-17 had almost no forward-firing defensive armament, just a single flexible machine gun in the plexiglass nose, operated by the bombardier who was supposed to be focused on his bomb sight, not air combat. Everything else, the ball turret below, the tail guns behind, the waist guns on the sides, all pointed backward or to the side. The front was nearly defenseless. It was an engineering choice that made sense. Fighters historically attacked from behind, chasing bombers. Why waste weight and complexity on guns pointing forward? But what if you didn't attack from behind? What if you came at them head-on, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour, giving them perhaps 2 seconds to react before you flashed past? The defensive firepower they were so proud of would be almost useless. Most of their 13 machine guns couldn't even point at you. Mayer keyed his radio. His wingmen acknowledged. 3 Focke-Wulfs in a tight V formation. They would attack from 12 o'clock high, slightly above, and directly in front of the bomber formation. It violated every doctrine. It required steel nerves because you were flying directly at aircraft that could still shoot at you. It required perfect timing because the closing speed meant you had perhaps 1.5 seconds of firing time before you'd smash into them or have to break away violently. But if it worked, the Americans' proud flying fortresses, with their 1350 caliber machine guns, would be as vulnerable as unescorted transports. Mayer pushed his throttle forward and nosed down, aiming for the lead B-17. His 2 wingmen followed, maintaining formation. The bombers grew larger in his windscreen with terrifying speed. He could see the plexiglass nose, the bombardier inside, probably just now realizing that a German fighter was coming straight at him. 600 yards. Mayer's finger moved to the trigger. 500 yards. The bomber's single nose gun opened. Fire, tracers arcing toward him, but the bombardier was trying to hit a fighter closing at 600 miles per hour. Impossible. 400 yards. Mayer fired. His 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns erupted. The recoil shuddered through the Focke-Wulf. 300 yards. He kept firing, holding the trigger down, pouring shells into the B-17's nose and cockpit. The plexiglass shattered. Pieces flew off the bomber's nose. 200 yards. Mayer yanked his stick hard right and rolled away. The B-17 filled his vision and then vanished as he flashed past, so close he could see rivets on the fuselage. His wingmen followed, their guns also firing, also rolling away at the last instant. Mayer pulled out of his roll and looked back. The lead B-17 was streaming smoke from its No. 3 engine. The nose section looked mangled. The aircraft was falling out of formation, losing altitude. His wingmen had damaged 2 others. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 3 bombers damaged or destroyed in a single firing pass. And the defensive fire had been minimal because most of the bombers' guns simply couldn't bear on targets attacking from directly ahead. Mayer had just discovered the B-17's Achilles heel, and he'd discovered it in the most practical way possible, by exploiting it in combat. The date was significant. November 23rd, 1942. This was Mayer's first victory against American 4-engine bombers. He would shoot down 2 B-17 seconds and 1 B-24 that day, his 53rd, 54th, and 55th victories. But more importantly, He'd proven a tactical concept that would reshape the air war over Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name, honestly. When it first flew in 1935, a reporter from the Seattle Times, observing the multiple machine gun positions, had called it a 15-ton flying fortress. The name stuck. By 1942, the latest models bristled with defensive armament. The B-17E, the first mass-produced version deployed to Europe, carried 950 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 9. That was more defensive firepower than any bomber in the world. The British Lancaster carried 8 machine guns, but they were smaller caliber. The German Heinkel 111 carried maybe 5 or 6 machine guns of mixed calibers. The B-17 was designed from the beginning as a self-defending bomber, capable of fighting its way to the target and back without fighter escort. The theory seemed sound. American war planners believed that massed formations of B-17 seconds, with their overlapping fields of fire, would create a defensive bubble so lethal that enemy fighters wouldn't dare approach. Each bomber could cover the others. A German pilot attacking one B-17 would be fired on by 5 or 6 others. The mathematics of mutual fire. Support should make the formations nearly invulnerable. Theory was one thing, reality was another. In November 1942, Egon Mayer stood on the tarmac at Beaumont-le-Roger airfield in France, looking at photographs of the first B-17E that had been shot down relatively intact. The wreckage had been assembled at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's test facility, where engineers could examine it in detail. Mayer wasn't an engineer, but he was an experienced combat pilot. Born in Konstanz in August 1917, he joined the Luftwaffe in 1937. By November 1942, at age 25, he'd already shot down 52 aircraft and been awarded the Knight's Cross. He was Gruppencommander of the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader to Richthofen, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings. His job was to stop American bombers from reaching their targets. And the B-17 seconds were presenting a serious problem. When German fighters attacked from behind using standard tactics, the results were mixed. Yes, you could shoot them down, but the defensive fire was murderous. The B-17's tail guns, the ball turret underneath, the waist guns on the sides, all concentrated their fire on you as you closed from the rear. Luftwaffe intelligence had calculated that it took approximately 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells, fired from behind, to bring down a B-17. 20 hits. And combat camera analysis showed that pilots of average ability hit bombers with only about 2% of the rounds they fired. To get 20 hits, an average pilot had to fire 1,000 rounds at a bomber. The early Focke-Wulf 190 carried maybe 500 rounds total for its 20mm cannons. You had ammunition for perhaps half an attack before you were dry. Even if you were an exceptional pilot and doubled the hit rate to 4%, you still needed 500 rounds to guarantee a kill. And while you were closing to firing range, taking careful aim, making that perfect shot, the B-17 was shooting back with multiple 50 caliber machine guns. American 50 caliber rounds were not toys. Each cartridge was 5.47 inches long and weighed nearly 2 ounces. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could punch through aluminum, could damage engines, could kill pilots, and the B-17 gunners weren't firing single shots. They were firing in long bursts, 750 rounds per minute per gun, filling the sky with metal. Attacking from behind was becoming a death trap. Luftwaffe pilots were getting shot down almost as fast as they were shooting down bombers. Something had to change. Mayer studied the reconnaissance photographs. The B-17E had machine guns in the tail, 2 of them in a powered turret. It had a ball turret underneath with 2 more. It had a dorsal turret above the fuselage with 2 more. It had single guns at the waist positions on each side. It had a radio operator's gun firing upward from the top of the fuselage. That was 9 guns total. But here was what caught Mayer's attention. The front of the aircraft, the nose section where the bombardier and navigator worked, had only 1 flexible 50 caliber machine gun. 1. And it was mounted on a simple socket, hand-aimed by the bombardier, who was supposed to be operating the Norden bombsight during the bombing run, not fighting off German fighters. There were no powered turrets in the nose, no fixed forward-firing guns. The entire front hemisphere of the B-17, the direction it was actually flying, was defended by a single manually operated weapon. Everything else pointed backward or to the sides. It was a massive blind spot. The American designers had assumed that fighters would attack from behind. They'd concentrated the defensive armament to cover rear approaches. They'd left the front almost naked. Mayer realized this was the key. Don't attack from where they expect you. Don't come in from behind where 9 guns can bear on you. Come at them from the front, where only 1 gun can shoot back, and that gun is hand-operated by someone whose primary job is bombing, not gunnery. But head-on attacks were dangerous for different reasons. The closing speed was immense. If a B-17 was cruising at 180 miles per hour, and a Focke-Wulf was attacking at 350 miles per hour, they were closing at over 530 miles per hour, almost 9 miles per minute, more than 750 feet per second. At that speed, you had perhaps 2 seconds of firing time before you'd either collide or have to break away violently. 2 seconds. In that time, you had to identify your target, aim carefully enough to hit a specific section of the aircraft, fire your guns, and pull away before impact. It required exceptional nerve. You were flying directly at a large, heavily built aircraft. If you misjudged the distance or if your reflexes were a fraction of a second too slow, you'd smash into the bomber at combined speeds that would disintegrate both aircraft instantly. Many pilots couldn't do it. The instinct to break away early was overwhelming. But for those who could master the technique, the rewards were substantial. A head-on attack gave the B-17 gunners almost no time to react. The ball turret gunner couldn't even rotate his turret fast enough to track you. The tail gunners couldn't see you at all. The waist gunners had perhaps a 1-second window as you flashed past. Only the bombardier had any real chance, and he was trying to aim a flexible handheld machine gun at a fighter moving at 750 feet per second directly toward him. And here was the crucial advantage. When attacking from behind, you were shooting at the B-17's strongest point. The tail section was heavily built. The tail guns were in an armoured turret. The rounds had to penetrate through multiple structural members to reach anything vital. But when attacking from the front, you were shooting at the weakest point. The nose was mostly plexiglass. Behind that thin barrier sat the bombardier and navigator, unprotected. Behind them was the cockpit, where the pilot and co-pilot sat. Hit the nose section with 20mm explosive shells, and you'd kill the bombardier and navigator instantly. Continue firing, and you'd hit the pilots. Or you could aim slightly to the side and hit the engines, which from the front were also vulnerable targets without the protection of the firewall. 4 or 5 good hits from the front, Luftwaffe studies would later confirm, could down a B-17. 4 or 5. Compare that to 20 hits from the rear. The efficiency was stunning. Mayer knew he was onto something, but he also knew that one pilot couldn't change the air war. He needed to systematize it, teach it, turn it into a doctrine that other pilots could use. He worked with Georg Peter Eder, another experienced pilot, to develop the technique. They refined the approach angle, 12 o'clock high, slightly above the bomber formation, diving down at a shallow angle. This gave the fighters a speed advantage and a better angle on the cockpit. They refined the formation. 3 fighters in a V, a ket, so they could concentrate firepower on a single bomber or engage multiple targets in one pass. They refined the firing solution. Don't aim at the bomber directly. Aim ahead of it, using deflection shooting, so your shells would intersect with the bomber's flight path. Then, just before impact, brake hard left or right and up, using the fighter's superior maneuverability to roll away. The first time Mayer tested this in combat was November 23, 1942, against a formation of B-17 seconds attacking the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire. He'd briefed his pilots carefully. Stay in formation, attack from 12 o'clock, fire a short burst, aim for the nose and cockpit, then break away immediately. Don't get greedy and try for a second pass from the same angle. The bombers would be ready for you. The attack worked beyond his expectations. 3 bombers damaged in a single pass with minimal return fire. The defensive firepower that made the B-17 seconds so feared from other angles was almost useless against this tactic. Mayer flew back to base, landed, and immediately started writing his after-action report. This needed to be shared with every fighter unit facing the American bombers. The impact was immediate. Other Luftwaffe pilots tried the head-on attack and found it worked. By December, it was becoming the preferred tactic. By early 1943, B-17 losses from frontal attacks were climbing steeply. American bomber crews, who'd been told their flying fortresses were nearly invulnerable, were discovering that 13 machine guns didn't matter if most of them couldn't shoot at the attacker. The psychological impact was profound. Bomber crews had to fly straight and level during the bomb run. That was when they were most vulnerable. And now they knew that. German fighters could come at them from the front, where they had almost no defense, and there was nothing they could do except hold formation, complete the bombing run, and hope they survived. Casualty rates soared. In the summer of 1943, bomber crews in the 8th Air Force faced a grim statistical reality. Over half never completed their required 25 mission tour. The life expectancy could be measured in missions. 5, maybe 6 before you were either killed, wounded, or captured. The B-17 was supposed to be a flying fortress, but it was being shot down with frightening regularity. Part of the problem was the deep penetration missions. American fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Spitfires, didn't have the range to escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. Once the fighters turned back, the bombers were on their own, and the Luftwaffe knew it. German fighters would wait, conserving fuel, until the American escorts reached their range limit and turned for home. Then they'd attack in force, using head-on tactics that bypassed the B-17's defensive armament. The results were catastrophic. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious mission yet. A double strike against Regensburg and Schweinfurt, both deep in southern Germany. Regensburg, over 400 miles inside occupied Europe, was beyond the range of any fighter escort. The bombers would be on their own for the entire mission. 230 B-17 seconds attacked Regensburg, 146 attacked Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe was waiting. They attacked using Mayer's head-on tactic, augmented with new weapons. Some fighters carried 21-centimeter rockets, adapted from infantry use, that could destroy a bomber from 30 yards away. Others carried the new 30mm Mk108 cannon, which fired 11-ounce explosive shells. 3 hits from a 30mm could down a B-17. The bombers fought back. Their gunners fired over 11,000 rounds per aircraft. The defensive formations helped. Bombers flying in tight combat boxes could support each other, creating overlapping fields of fire. But against head-on attacks, that support was minimal. The front of the formation took devastating losses. By the end of the mission, 60 B-17 seconds had been shot down. 60. Out of 376 aircraft, a loss rate of nearly 16%. Among the bomber crews, morale collapsed. Flying deep penetration missions without fighter escort was suicide. Egon Mayer continued his aerial campaign. By July 1943, he'd been promoted to major and given command of all of Jagdgeschwader II as Geschwader Commodore, the wing commander. His victory total kept climbing. On September 6, 1943, he shot down 3 B-17 seconds in 19 minutes during a raid on Stuttgart. His technique was flawless. Attack from 12 o'clock high. Fire a concentrated burst. Break. Away. Repeat. American bomber crews learned to fear the head-on attack. They reported seeing German fighters coming straight at them, growing larger with terrifying speed. Then the flash of cannon fire, the sound of shells hitting, the bomber shuddering from impacts, and then the German fighter was gone, having flashed past at hundreds of miles per hour. There was no time to react, no time to aim carefully. The ball turret gunner couldn't even see the attack until it was over. The tail gunner was useless. Only the bombardier in the nose had any chance, and he was firing a handheld weapon at a target closing at 12 miles per minute. The Americans understood they had a serious problem. The B-17E and early F models had a critical vulnerability. The lack of forward defensive firepower was getting crews killed. They needed a solution fast. before the bomber offensive collapsed under unsustainable losses. Engineers at Boeing and at field modification centres in England began working on the problem. Various solutions were tested. Some B-17Fs had a pair of 50 caliber machine guns bolted directly to the sides of the nose, the so-called cheek guns. These gave better frontal coverage, but they were hand-operated, heavy and awkward to aim. Better than nothing, but not a complete solution. The real answer came from a failed experiment. In 1943, the Army Air Forces had tried creating a heavily armed escort version called the YB-40. This aircraft carried 14 50 caliber machine guns, including a powered Bendix chin turret mounted below the nose with 2 guns. The YB-40 could fire forward with concentrated, aimed, powered turret fire. The YB-40 project failed because the aircraft was too heavy. Once the other bombers dropped their bombs and became lighter, the YB-40 couldn't keep up. But the chin turret worked beautifully. It could track targets in the forward hemisphere with accuracy. It provided exactly the kind of frontal firepower that the B-17 desperately needed. By summer 1943, Boeing was incorporating the chin turret into production aircraft. The result was the B-17G, the definitive version of the Flying Fortress. The G model carried 13 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the chin turret, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the tail turret, 2 cheek guns in the nose, 1 radio operator's gun, and 2 waist guns. 13. All 50 caliber. All feeding from a total ammunition supply of over 11,000 rounds. The chin turret changed everything. Now, when German fighters attacked from 12 o'clock high, they faced 2 powered, aimed machine guns that could track them accurately. The advantage that Egon Mayer had exploited was gone. The B-17's blind spot had been eliminated. But by then, the damage was done. From November 1942, when Mayer first used the tactic, through summer 1943, when the B-17G entered service, thousands of bomber crew members had died because of that vulnerability. And Mayer's innovation had taught the Luftwaffe a broader lesson. Don't assume your enemy has no weaknesses. Study them. Find the gaps in their design. Exploit those gaps ruthlessly. The B-17 had 13 machine guns, but if most of them couldn't shoot at you, they might as well not exist. Mayer continued his combat career through 1943 and into 44. He reached his 90th victory on December 31st. On February 5th, 1944, he became the first fighter pilot to achieve 100 victories entirely on the Western Front. 100 confirmed kills. His final combat mission was March 2nd, 1944. He led his wing against another American bomber raid. The bombers were now escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts deep into German territory. New drop tanks gave the American fighters the range they'd previously lacked. Mayer's formation was intercepted by the escorts. In the swirling dogfight that followed, Mayer's Focke-Wulf was shot down near Montmédy, France. The pilot who got him was Lieutenant Walter Gresham of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group. Mayer was 26 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest military decorations. His final score was 102 confirmed victories, including 26 four-engine bombers. But his legacy wasn't just the number of aircraft he shot down. It was the tactical innovation he'd pioneered. He'd looked at the B-17 Flying Fortress, with its famous 13 machine guns, and realized that those guns only mattered if they could point at you. Find the blind spot, attack where they can't defend, turn their strength into irrelevance. From late 1942 through mid-1943, that tactic killed thousands of Allied airmen. The American response, the B-17G with its chin turret, came too late for many crews. And even after the G model entered service, Luftwaffe pilots continued using frontal attacks because the technique itself remained sound. Come at them fast, from an unexpected angle, give them minimal time to react. The air war over Europe became a brutal contest of innovation and counter-innovation. Every advantage was temporary. Every weakness, once discovered, was exploited. The B-17's designers had created a formidable aircraft, but they'd made an assumption about how it would be attacked. Egon Mayer proved that assumption wrong in the most lethal way possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The defensive armament evolution didn't stop with the B-17G. The entire philosophy of bomber defense was being questioned. The original theory, that mass defensive firepower would protect bombers without fighter escort, was failing. Yes, the bombers had impressive guns. Yes, they could shoot back. But combat was proving that no amount of defensive armament could substitute for fighter protection. The statistics told the story. During unescorted missions deep into Germany in 1943, bomber loss rates sometimes exceeded 20%. 1 in 5 aircraft shot down on a single mission. With a 10-man crew per B-17, that meant 30 or more crewmen killed, wounded, or captured for every 3 bombers lost. The mathematics of attrition were unsustainable. At these rates, entire bomb groups could be wiped out in weeks. The turning point came not from better defensive armament, but from a completely different solution. Long-range fighter escorts. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could fly all the way to Berlin and back. Suddenly, American bombers weren't alone. German fighters that had waited for the escorts to turn back found themselves fighting P-51 seconds over their own airfields. The equation changed fundamentally. A B-17 with 1350 caliber machine guns still couldn't dogfight a Focke-Wulf 190, but it didn't need to. The P-51 seconds would handle the German fighters while the bombers completed their mission. The defensive guns were now a backup, not the primary defense, but the story of the B-17's defensive armament reveals something deeper about military technology and tactical innovation. The Americans had built an aircraft with more defensive firepower than any bomber in history. 13 heavy machine guns, over 11,000 rounds of ammunition, powered turrets that could track targets with precision. It should have been enough. It wasn't. Because Egon Mayer and his fellow pilots found the one angle where all that firepower was useless. They attacked from 12 o'clock, where only one gun could bear on them in the early models. They turned the B-17's greatest strength into irrelevance by simply avoiding it. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Every new weapon system came with assumptions about how it would be used and how the enemy would respond. Clever opponents found ways around those assumptions. The German response to the B-17G with its chin turret was to develop even heavier weapons. The 30mm Mk108 cannon that could destroy a bomber with 3 hits. Air-to-air rockets that didn't require precise aim. Even experiments with weapons like the Sondergerät SG-113A, a massive 50mm cannon that could literally blow a bomber apart with a single shell. The Americans responded by adding more armor, improving formation tactics, and most critically, providing constant fighter escort. By 1944, the sky over Germany was filled with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that outnumbered and outperformed the Luftwaffe defenders. The defensive armament race became secondary to the fundamental question of air superiority. Inside a B-17 during combat, the experience was terrifying regardless of how many guns the aircraft carried. The ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Alan McGee, described what it was like during a mission over Saint-Nazaire in January 1943. His B-17 was attacked by German fighters. He fired back from his cramped position in the belly turret, tracking the Focke-Wulfs as they flashed past. Then, a 20mm shell hit near his position. The plexiglass shattered. He was blown out of the aircraft at 22,000 feet without a parachute. McGee fell 4 miles and crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station. Incredibly, he survived. The glass roof had acted like a series of braking surfaces, slowing his fall just enough. He was severely injured, but alive. German soldiers captured him and took him to a hospital. The German doctor who treated him couldn't believe anyone could survive such a fall. But McGee's survival illustrated something about the B-17 crews. They kept flying missions, knowing the statistics were against them. The defensive guns gave them something to fight back with, some illusion of control. A ball turret gunner who shot down a German fighter felt like he'd contributed to his own survival. Whether the aircraft had 9 guns or 13, the psychological impact of being able to fire back was significant. Bomber crews weren't helpless. They could defend themselves, even if the defense wasn't always effective. The tail gunner position was particularly valued. This was the last line of defense against attacks from behind, which remained the most common even after Mayer's head-on tactic became widespread. The tail gunner sat in an isolated position at the very back of the aircraft, surrounded by plexiglass and 250 caliber machine guns. He had the best view of attacking fighters and was often the first to spot them. Technical Sergeant Robert Goebel, a tail gunner with the 306th Bomb Group, described the experience in his memoirs. During a mission over Germany in October 1943, his B-17 was attacked by multiple Bf-109 fighters. They came in from 6 o'clock, directly behind, where his guns had the best coverage. He fired burst after burst, the twin 50s hammering, spent casings flying everywhere. One of the German fighters broke off trailing smoke. He claimed it as a probable kill. But even as he fired, he could see other German fighters attacking bombers in the formation. Watching a B-17 go down was devastating. You knew there were 10 men on that aircraft. Some might bail out if they had time. Most wouldn't. The aircraft would fall, burning, spinning, breaking apart, and you'd keep flying, keep fighting, because there were still hours to go before you'd reach home. The waist gunners stood in the middle section of the fuselage, one on each side, with single 50 caliber machine guns mounted in open windows. Early B-17 models had separate windows on each side, which created terrible wind buffeting at altitude. Later models used a staggered window arrangement that improved things slightly. The waist gunners had perhaps the most exposed position in the entire aircraft. They stood in sub-zero temperatures at 25,000 feet, wearing heated suits that often malfunctioned, firing their guns at fighters that flashed past in fractions of a second. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer, a waist gunner, described firing at a Focke-Wulf that was attacking from the side. The fighter was maybe 200 yards away, closing fast. He led it slightly, fired a long burst, saw his tracers arc toward the target. The fighter rolled away and he lost sight of it. Did he hit it? Impossible to know. There was no time to assess. Another fighter was already coming in from a different angle. Multiple gunners often fired at the same target. After the mission, they'd all claim the kill. The 8th Air Force tried to sort out who actually shot down which fighter, but it was mostly guesswork. Gun camera footage helped when available, but most defensive positions didn't have cameras. The official tally showed 8th Air Force bomber gunners claiming over 6,000 German fighters destroyed. The actual number was certainly lower, probably much lower, but the psychological impact of being able to fire back was immeasurable. The top turret gunner, usually the flight engineer, sat directly above the cockpit in a powered Sperry turret. This position had excellent visibility and could cover attacks from above and to the sides. The turret could rotate 360 degrees and elevate to nearly vertical. It was one of the most effective defensive positions on the aircraft, but it was also cramped and exhausting. The gunner crouched in the turret for hours, scanning the sky, ready to track and fire at any threat. Technical Sergeant Forrest Vossler was a top turret gunner and radio operator on a B-17 during a mission over Bremen in December 1943. His aircraft was hit by German fighters. A 20mm shell exploded near his position, shredding the radio equipment and severely wounding him in the legs and chest. Shrapnel destroyed both his eyes. Blinded, bleeding, he continued operating his position, guiding other crew members by sound and touch. He helped wounded crew members and assisted with the aircraft's damaged radio until they reached England. He survived and was awarded the Medal of Honor. These stories illustrated that the defensive armament, whether 9 guns or 13, was only as effective as the men operating it, and those men were flying missions knowing that the statistical probability of completing a tour was low. In early 1943, before the B-17G and before effective long-range fighter escorts, survival rates were abysmal. Some bomb groups lost over half their aircraft in just a few months. The 100th Bomb Group, known as the Bloody 100th, was particularly hard hit. They lost 12 aircraft on one mission to Regensburg. Another, 9 on a mission to Münster. The attrition was constant and crushing. Captain John Luckadoo, a pilot with the 100th, calculated that there was a 400% turnover in the first 90 days of combat. 400%. That meant everyone who started was replaced, and then those replacements were replaced, and some of those replacements were replaced. The mathematics of survival were brutal. 25 missions to complete a tour. Loss rates sometimes exceeding 10% per mission. Run those numbers and very few crews finished their tours. The defensive guns helped psychologically. They gave crews something to do besides sit passively while fighters attacked. But they couldn't change the fundamental equation. Unescorted bombers penetrating deep into enemy territory, even heavily armed ones, were vulnerable to determined fighter attacks. The solution wasn't more guns, it was fighter protection. By late 1944, the situation had transformed completely. The P-51 Mustang, with its exceptional range and performance, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated German skies in 1943, was being ground down by attrition. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and overwhelming American numbers meant that German fighters were increasingly scarce. The B-17 seconds still carried their 1350 caliber machine guns, but they rarely needed to use them because the P-51 seconds were handling the German fighters. The defensive armament had evolved from primary defense to backup. The real protection came from the fighter escorts. This was the lesson that military planners took forward. Bomber defensive armament had limits. You could add more guns, more turrets, more ammunition, but at some point you were just adding weight without adding meaningful protection. Better to have lighter bombers with longer range and better fighter escorts than to build flying fortresses that were slow, expensive, and still vulnerable. The post-war strategic bombers reflected this lesson. The B-29 Superfortress carried defensive guns, but fewer than the B-17. The B-36 Peacemaker carried guns initially, but they were later removed. The B-52 Stratofortress carried only tail guns, and eventually those were removed too. Modern strategic bombers carry no defensive guns at all. They rely on speed, altitude, electronic countermeasures, and most critically, air superiority fighters to protect them. But in World War II, the B-17's 13 guns represented the peak of bomber defensive armament philosophy. It was an attempt to create a bomber that could defend itself through firepower alone. The attempt partially succeeded. The B-17 could defend itself much better than earlier bombers. The combat box formations, with their overlapping fields of fire, created genuine defensive capabilities. German fighters that attacked recklessly suffered heavy casualties, but the B-17 couldn't defend itself completely. Egon Mayer proved that by finding its blind spot and exploiting it with head-on attacks, the American engineers responded by adding the chin turret, eliminating the blind spot. The Germans responded by developing heavier weapons that could destroy bombers from longer ranges. The Americans responded with fighter escorts. The cycle continued until the Luftwaffe simply ran out of resources to continue the fight. The final accounting was sobering. The United States lost over 4,700 B-17 seconds during World War II, over 47,000 bomber crew members killed, wounded, or captured. The vast majority of those losses occurred before effective long-range fighter escorts became available. The defensive armament, impressive as it was, couldn't prevent those losses. It could only make the German fighters pay a price for inflicting them. From the German perspective, attacking B-17 formations was extraordinarily dangerous. The defensive fire was real and lethal. Luftwaffe fighters that attacked the bomber streams suffered heavy casualties, but they kept attacking because they had to. Those bombers were hitting German cities, German factories, German military installations. The strategic bombing campaign was destroying Germany's ability to continue the war. The Luftwaffe had to stop the bombers, regardless of cost. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, a Luftwaffe night fighter pilot who occasionally engaged B-17 seconds during daylight raids, described the experience in his post-war memoir. The American bombers flew in tight formations. As you approached, You could see dozens of gun barrels tracking you. The instant you came into range, they all opened fire. The sky filled with tracers, all arcing toward you. You'd pick a target, commit to the attack, fire your weapons, and hope you hit something vital before you had to break away. The entire attack lasted seconds, but those seconds felt like hours because you knew that hundreds of .50 caliber rounds were trying to find you. The B-17 gunners, for their part, were firing at targets that often passed too quickly to track properly. A fighter closing at 400 miles per hour gave you perhaps 2 seconds of firing time. In that time, you had to identify the target, calculate deflection, aim, fire, and hope your rounds connected. The hit rate was low, maybe 2 to 5% for an average gunner, but with 6 or 8 gunners firing at the same target, the cumulative effect was significant. The Germans learned to respect the defensive fire. They developed tactics to minimize exposure. The head-on attack was one. Another was the high-speed slashing attack from above, diving through the formation at maximum speed, firing in one quick burst, then using momentum to climb back up out of range. These tactics reduced the time spent in the defensive fire zone, but they also reduced accuracy. You couldn't aim carefully when you were diving at 500 miles per hour. Some Luftwaffe pilots specialized in bomber destruction. They developed techniques, practiced them endlessly, and became extraordinarily effective. Hauptmann Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, a night fighter pilot, was credited with destroying over 120 Allied aircraft, mostly British bombers. He approached from below and behind, staying out of the defensive fire arc until the last moment, then pulling up and firing a devastating burst into the bomber's belly. His technique required perfect spatial awareness and nerves of steel. During daylight attacks on B-17 formations, the most successful Luftwaffe pilots used similar principles. Find an angle that minimizes defensive fire. Close quickly to reduce exposure time. Fire accurately to make the brief firing opportunity count. Break away violently before the gunners can adjust. These were the pilots who survived and accumulated high victory totals. The ones who didn't follow these principles often died on their first or second combat mission against the B-17 seconds. The Americans kept refining their defensive tactics throughout the war. The combat box formation evolved into increasingly sophisticated arrangements. By 1944, a typical combat wing consisted of multiple bomb groups flying in a staggered three-dimensional formation. The lead group flew at one altitude, the second group flew slightly lower and to one side, the third group flew lower still and offset further. The result was a formation that stretched through several thousand feet of altitude and occupied significant airspace. Any German fighter approaching the formation would be in range of multiple bombers simultaneously. The overlapping fields of fire created a bubble of defensive protection. But maintaining these tight formations required extraordinary flying skill, especially in bad weather or combat conditions. Bombers couldn't take evasive action without breaking formation. They had to fly straight and level, accepting whatever punishment the German fighters and flak could dish out. The defensive guns were their only active defense, and those guns required disciplined fire control. Early in the war, gunners sometimes fired at targets that were out of range, wasting ammunition. They learned to hold fire until fighters closed to within effective range, typically 500 yards or less, then deliver concentrated bursts. Ammunition discipline became critical, because once you ran out, you were defenseless. The radio operator's gun, positioned above the fuselage, had perhaps the least effective field of fire. It covered a relatively small arc and was hand-operated, but it filled a gap that would otherwise be completely undefended. During an attack from above and behind, the radio operator's gun could engage targets that the top turret couldn't track because they were directly overhead. Every gun position had a specific responsibility. The tail gunner covered 6 o'clock. The ball turret covered below. The top turret covered above and to the sides. The waist. Gunners covered the beam positions. The nose guns, including the chin turret in the G model, covered forward approaches. The cheek guns provided additional forward and side coverage. It was a comprehensive defensive system, at least on paper. In practice, combat was chaotic. Fighters attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. Gunners fired at different targets, often the same target without realizing it. The aircraft maneuvered, making gunnery difficult. Guns jammed, ammunition ran out, systems failed, gunners were wounded or killed. The carefully designed defensive system degraded under combat stress into something more primitive, scared men firing at anything that looked like a German fighter, hoping to survive the next few seconds. And yet, despite all the limitations and chaos, the defensive armament worked well enough to make bomber operations viable. The B-17 seconds reached their targets. They dropped their bombs. Many of them came home. The losses were heavy, but not catastrophic enough to stop the strategic bombing campaign. From the perspective of Allied planners, the defensive armament was adequate for the mission. From the perspective of the crews flying those missions, the 13 guns represented survival. Each gun was a chance to shoot down the fighter attacking you. Each tracer round arcing toward a German fighter was hope, a message that said, "We can fight back. We're not helpless." Whether those rounds actually hit didn't matter as much as the psychological boost from firing them. You were doing something. You were fighting. You weren't just a passive victim waiting to be shot down. The German pilots who faced those 13 guns had a different perspective. They saw a target that was difficult to approach and dangerous to attack. The defensive fire was intense and accurate enough to kill you if you made mistakes, but it wasn't invincible. With the right tactics, the right approach angle, and enough determination, you could get through the defensive fire and destroy the bomber. The question was whether you'd survive the attempt. Many didn't. The bomber formations extracted a heavy toll from the Luftwaffe. By early 1945, the air war over Europe had decisively shifted. The Luftwaffe was a shell of its former strength. Fuel shortages kept many fighters grounded. Experienced pilots had been killed or captured. The replacements were poorly trained, sometimes with fewer than 50 hours of total flight time. They faced American pilots with hundreds of hours of training and combat experience, flying aircraft that were superior in almost every way. The B-17 seconds continued flying missions, but now they faced minimal opposition. The defensive guns, once crucial for survival, were rarely used. The war was winding down. Germany was collapsing. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved its objective of destroying Germany's industrial capacity and military infrastructure. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its 1350 caliber machine guns, had played a central role in that campaign. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of the B-17's defensive armament extended beyond World War II. It represented a specific philosophy about bomber operations, a belief that defensive firepower could protect bombers without fighter escort. That philosophy was tested in the crucible of combat and found wanting, but not entirely wrong. The defensive guns did help. They did save lives. They just weren't sufficient by themselves. Modern military aviation absorbed those lessons. Strategic bombers now rely on different forms of protection: electronic warfare, stealth technology, standoff weapons that can be launched from beyond enemy defenses, and most critically, air superiority fighters that clear the skies before bombers arrive. The idea of a self-defending bomber, bristling with machine guns, became obsolete. But for a brief period in history, the B-17, with its 1350 caliber Brownings, represented the peak of that philosophy. It was an impressive achievement in defensive armament design. The powered turrets, the overlapping fields of fire, the sheer volume of ammunition, all spoke to American engineering ingenuity and industrial capacity. The Germans couldn't match it. No other nation built a bomber with comparable defensive firepower, and yet one German fighter pilot, Egon Mayer, looked at those 13 guns and found the angle where they didn't matter. He attacked from the front where only one gun could fire back. He developed a tactic that bypassed the entire defensive system, and for months, that tactic killed Allied airmen in significant numbers until American engineers responded with the Chin turret. It was innovation versus counter-innovation, tactics versus technology, a brutal contest where mistakes were measured in lives lost. The B-17 crews who flew through that period, from late 1942 through mid-1943, faced the worst of it. They flew aircraft with a known vulnerability that enemy pilots were actively exploiting. They watched bombers in their formations go down to head-on attacks, knowing their own aircraft could be next, and they kept flying because the mission required it. The 1350 caliber machine guns gave them tools to fight back. Whether those tools were adequate is debatable, but they were better than nothing. And in the end, combined with better tactics, improved variants, and, most importantly, long-range fighter escorts, they were enough to achieve the objective. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded. Germany was defeated. The B-17 crews contributed to that victory, and many of them paid for it with their lives. The defensive armament couldn't save them all, but it gave them a fighting chance, and sometimes that was all the difference between survival and death at 25,000 feet over hostile territory.